Good afternoon, folks. Please get yourself settled. So, how have the last couple days been for you guys? Have been good? Thank you. We wanted to say one of our best presentations for last, and I'm Walt Zubritsky, and I'm a board member, and it's my honor to and pleasure to introduce our two speakers for this last session of our event. Now, we're also going to have a few comments by one of our board members, Judy, at the end, so don't rush off, because she's got some interesting information to share with you as well. Carolyn Montague is a partner in Performance Management Network and a volunteer president of the Canadian Institut for Procurement and Materiel Management. I had to write that down because I couldn't remember it. And Craig Szelestowski, hope I'm pronouncing that right, good, is founder of Lean Agility and director of Lean Programs at the Telfer Business School, Center for Executive Leadership at the University of Ottawa. They'll be sharing with you practical ways of improving the performance of your procurement activities. Please welcome Carolyn and Greg.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have a challenge just sitting and not moving my hands, so I may actually get up and dance a bit. Glad to be here. I'm glad to see so many of you here still. It's always a tough act to be the last one. Procurement, I think we'll be honest, we're not going to teach you all the rules and regulations, and we're not going to try and turn you into procurement officers. I think you got day jobs, but we are hoping that we can give you a few ideas and tips that you can take away and make your world a little bit easier. I understand there's already been a conversation around Amanda Clark's recent study, as well as some of you may have read in the Globe and Mail recently about some IT procurement experiences. Let's just say it's a hot topic these days. But again, let's just get underway and see where we go with this. So who are we? Well, as Walt has said, my volunteer gig is as the president of the Canadian Institut for Procurement and Materiel Management. And like PPX, we also have a Willow group helping us. We actually provide professional development, mentoring program, networking, learning opportunities for federal government employees predominantly. In our world, they're not planners, and they're not performance measurement, and they're not program evaluation. They would be procurement, material management, logistics, and fleet people. But often much of the same concerns, in the sense of having lots of rules and regulations and trying to get things moved forward because of things like those mandate letters and such. As also indicated, yes, I am a partner in Performance Management Network. We're one of the sponsors of this conference as well, and very proud of that. My colleague Craig, I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Craig. I'm a recovered public servant executive, and I'm running my own practice now, similar to Carolyn. We work almost exclusively with government and helping them streamline their processes and make them more humane for themselves and for their clients as well. And the part I'm going to talk about is really on the side of some projects we've done where the teams we've worked with have been able to reduce the time to procure, like a competitive RFP, from first contact through developing the tools, the documents, posting and evaluating, and selection, and then negotiation and signature used to be 5 to 7 months, 3 to 5 months, 3 to 7 months, and they're doing it now in 3 weeks by default without heroics. So we'll show you some tips on that so that you can learn some things that you can do. Even though you're not the procurement department, there's some things you can do as clients to make this a bit easier for yourself.
So, by a show of hands, just to give us some context, how many of you have ever been involved in a procurement activity? So I see a few. Okay. How many of you would say it went well? Not so many. How many of you would say it probably took too long? Yeah, immediately the hands go up. I mean, it's pretty daunting. You know, here we are in third quarter. You know you have some money to do a study. You know, your management team is very needing this study to be done. And someone says, well, no, that'll take a year or two. But it's only a $70,000 study. Why does it have to take that long? I mean, so again, some of these, we're going to give you some ideas around what you may or may not be able to do. I would ask those of you that put your hands up and those that even didn't to keep in mind some of your experiences, because we're going to have a Q&A at the end, and you know, again, there might be some real specific things we can suggest as well. I've been at this since 1982. Came out of graduate school, Masters of Public Admin from Carleton, and went into an intern officer program. So I've been around for a long, long time. In terms of objectives, mine is to provide you with some tips and techniques and ideas, and Craig's going to go through a case study with you to teach you a little bit about the lean principles, and I think they both come well together. So this particular sort of slide is just to give you, again, a bit of context. The process that you go through in procurement, whether it be for a good or service, $1 million recovery, you know, icebreaker, or whether it be for a small study you need, the process is pretty much the same. You begin with a planning phase. You go from that into a solicitation phase, whether you're soliciting one bidder through a sole source or competitive. And then you go through an evaluation. So even when it's a sole source, you want to evaluate that they really can do the work for you. Then you go through contract approval, and then you go into contract administration. So how long does it take to get through it? Well, those bars on either side, the trade agreements, the court decisions, the Treasury Board policies, your departmental rules, they tend to elongate or shorten the process, but the process is pretty much the same. So why do you need to even care about it? Well, because in some of the different phases, you play a bigger role in determining how fast you go through that process. And based on what you do in some of those early phases, you'll see I've got a little, you know, arrow down to the bottom. So what you did in the last contract, you need to incorporate that learning into the next one. So we've got this sort of feedback loop, as we say. So who does what to whom? Well, there used to be a funny joke, and I can't always tell the jokes very well, about who's on first. It's about baseball. I'm not a baseball fan as much, but I would say that depending upon what phase you're in, your role is going to allow you more control and more say than not. But I also, our daughter just recently had a baby, so, you know, it's the What to Expect When You're Expecting book. I always read that. So I always would read the chapter ahead to find out what was going to happen next, and she did the same, although hers is, I think, a virtual book now. But where I apply that same principle to procurement, you want to always know what's the next decision you've got to make, what's the next document you need to prepare, what's the next process you need, how can you get the organization ready? Because if you don't, then you can be faced with situations as I was recently. I have a contract with ESDC. Sorry if there's anybody here from ESDC. And the contract was, the proposal was written in March. I got the contract in September. And they want me to use their departmental access. But nobody set it up. So I got access yesterday. So I've not been able to do any work until then. So it's things like that that we're going to be talking a little bit more about, trying to be ready. So this is the first of many tables we're going to see about the different processes and the different phases. And I'm not going to go through each bullet point in them. But what I want you to keep notice of is what body is on the left-hand side of the table. So in the planning phase, it's you, the client, the project authority, the technical authority. Why is that important? Because you start it. You initiate it, you are the one that defines it, and you are the OPI of this. So this is when, in fact, from a procurement perspective, the procurement officer is responding to you, but actually they are looking to you to provide them more ideas around what you want and need. So again, a meeting with a different client today, and they've got different requirements tied to an IM requirement. And we ended up saying, you know, I think there's 4 different requirements. They're related. I think here's maybe the sequencing we're doing. One, we're going to do a sole source. One, we're going to do a competitive RFP. One, we're going to do maybe an RFI on. But they're all related. But again, I'm trying to teach my client so when they go to the procurement person, they can say, yes, there are 4 items in the bucket, so to speak. But let's look at them as four items in the same bucket, as opposed to when they were going to the procurement folks one off at a time, they were getting a lot of resistance. And also, a different procurement officer for each file. So I want you to think about this first phase, the planning one, as being a very, very important one. How quickly you get through it is really often dependent upon you creating documents that are going to be used later on. I'm just going to go back for a minute just to show you one thing, though. You'll see there's a line between the planning and solicitation. Well, many years ago, there was a very famous court decision at the Supreme Court of Canada that effectively imposed obligations on the federal government, on public sector. And effectively, it's as you go through and jump over, so you go from the planning to the next phase. The minute you step over into that solicitation, the expectation is you will proceed to award a contract as long as there's one compliant bidder. Now I got to tell you, there's lots of times that you get that technical result, you get the contract, and it's not the contractor you really wanted. Unfortunately, you don't really have a choice. And I've had many a client who said, well, I don't want to contract with them. And I said, well, your DG is going to have a conversation with another DG, but you're probably going to go ahead. Because if you break that rule, you stop and don't proceed, the Crown owes obligations, duties to mitigate it. And it has occurred. So we always want to make sure that when we step over into solicitation, we're ready for it. And sometimes we're not. Sometimes what we learn in our planning phase changes our scope dramatically, or something that occurs in the timeline that you don't control. I mean, yes, we did get told, I think was it August or July, that you needed to find $15.2 billion worth of savings, but that certainly is affecting your April 1, 2024 budgets. So if you're planning a big initiative right now, that's changed, and it's changing lots of procurements as well. So we need to be very conscious of what we can do. So in our planning phase, you're responsible for writing probably 2 or 3 very critical documents. One is called the Statement of Work. That's the name we use for services. It's a good, we usually call it a Statement of Requirement. I wouldn't worry about it. It's a requirement definition. And there's lots of templates out there. They all generally cover the same topics, just in different orders. But there's some tricks to them. If in the next one is the evaluation criteria, then there's some other documents that we're not going to talk about. But again, today we're going to look a little bit about some things you could do to make it a little bit easier. So what are some common problems we have with statements of work? Well, one common problem we have is often that somebody will have in their statement of work, in the scope, they'll define a certain way. The tasks will describe something a little bit different. The deliverables will actually identify deliverables that there's no task logically for them. And then when we go to the very back of the statement of work in a project schedule, there's other things there. And it can be something just as simple as we called them slightly different. So it could be it was a project meeting that somewhere else is called a status meeting, that is somewhere else an engagement activity, and somebody who wrote them thought they were all the same, and that we would logically know that. But the contractor doesn't know that. The bidder doesn't know that. So they may bid 4 activities, and the challenge then becomes one of, you're not probably going to get what you want, and that's not our answer. So we, from a very basic, what's the most common problem, I would say that's it. You put things in, and you put them all over the place, and there's no logic to them. There's no sequencing in them. We find lots of times people will use things they'll describe deliverables, and as I say, there's no tasks. So you can have a task and no deliverable, but you can't have a deliverable without a task. And what I see so often is what people call tasks are deliverables as well. So tasks have action words in them. If I don't see an action word, I think it's a deliverable. And the challenge then becomes one of, we now have confusion. Confusion equates into you're probably not going to get what you want. Another problem we find quite often is that people tend to think of, then when they write a statement of work, that everything will go really well. Now, I've been married to someone for 40 years, and he sits over there, and I can tell you, things don't always go well. So you have to, when you write a statement of work, you have to actually think about how are you protecting yourself? How are you writing it so that you've got a definition of what good work looks like? And for sure, talk with your colleagues about what bad work looks like, because that's what you want to avoid. And so sometimes I've actually gone so far as in a statement of work that I'm writing for someone to say, and it doesn't include. Because again, using some of the categories that you guys often will buy, organizational development consultants, program evaluation consultants. Well, what they had a program evaluation consultant do at fisheries might be different than what they have them do at transport. But the consultant doesn't know that. And if you write a very vague statement of work, because people seem to think a vague statement of work protects you, it doesn't. It means something's missing, and if it's missing, you can't enforce it. So what we want to be thinking about is making sure it's as full and complete as possible. So a couple of tips. One that's really simple: state your assumptions that you're making in terms of availability of people, data, and equipment as you're preparing your statement of work, and then test them. Because if you had, then Mr. Montague and I wouldn't have had the experience of working on a job way back in, I think it was 2002, that we were looking at how different departments were implementing the intellectual property policy. And the person who wrote the statement of work assumed that every department recorded the exceptions in the same way. So one of our tasks was to go and collect 10 departments, 10 commodities, 10 files per commodity to compare. But only 9 departments did not record the information in that manner. We discovered that midway through when we went to go do it. So if somebody had said, we're assuming the data is available and checked before contracting, we wouldn't have had the experience we did, which is we had tools down for 6 weeks, and then we had to figure out a new methodology to collect the information, figure out whether that was still within the budget, and then, of course, we ran into, now it was March, and it was March Madness, and you can't go and get contracting files from contracting that are old files in March. So it was an undoable thing. So write your assumptions down as you define them in terms of access. Same things with people. When you want a consultant to do interviews, or you want them to have access to something that was perhaps in another department, check whether or not they can get it, because some departments will not share with each other. So by stating them, you'll have something that's more doable. Another one, combine your tasks, activities, and deliverables and timelines into a table, a single table. What that does is it allows you to see the inner logic of the work. And with clients, I usually say, let's start with the last thing they give you. Maybe it's a final report. Maybe it's a presentation. What do they need to do before that? What do they need to do before that? And by having it in a table, what we'd start to see is what things they could be doing in parallel, what things they cannot do in parallel, what things you need to actually have a review function on, and what things you could speed things up by giving them templates and things like that. A couple of other little tips, because you can all read, I think, most of this, is that I think we tend to think of a statement of work as just a piece of paper. And I really think that you need to think about how you like to manage. So it's when the contractor comes in the door, how are you going to manage? Now, many of you may have experiences where you have new staff coming on. So maybe this is an opportunity to have them shadow the consultant. Or maybe they could participate in, if there's a lit review, they could do some of the early work on that. So these are different things that you could also include. I know we write statements of work as the contractor will do this and then the contractor will do that. It doesn't really work that way. The contractor does this, then you do that. Then the contractor does this and you do that. Because a lot of times, you in fact have to review a deliverable, provide your comments, get them to adjust it, and that needs to be factored into the timeline. So when we look at that table, it helps us with how long this should take for us, allowing for those review processes. And my final point with regard to this would be, don't always think that every deliverable is going to require that same magical 5 days of review, and I'll then provide you the comments, which is the standard thing that's cut and paste every single time. Because some of you are in departments that you need to consult other departments or consult other stakeholders. Health is a really good example of that. I've got lots of time for health and public health, I must say, and usually they need 6 weeks to review a deliverable because there's a broad consultation process. Or sometimes it's a specific deliverable. So you can actually have a different timeline for certain deliverables in terms of your review. So all of these are ideas for you to keep in mind, but we also want to think about the relationship between a statement of work and criteria. So your statement of work is when you have the contract, is now in place. We peel off the statement of work. We update it if we have to for timelines because we didn't know when the contract was going to be signed. And it gets attached to the contract. The evaluation criteria is set aside, and we don't really return to it unless there's a problem later. But the evaluation criteria is predominantly proxies that will allow you to feel comfortable that that supplier could do the work that you need to have done. So again, when we're writing our criteria, we need to make sure that the criteria relates to the statement of work. We also have to make sure that we are really specific about the unique things. Because if we write evaluation criteria that's too generic, it's really everybody wins. Everybody gets the passes, everybody gets meets the minimum score, and then it comes down to price. And that's usually not something of good value. What's the difference between our mandatory and rated criteria? Not a lot. The same thing can be the subject of a mandatory criteria and it could be subject of a rated criteria. It's just how much is different. So usually our mandatory is our base amount. Sometimes we might say things like you need to have experience, let's say, doing program evaluation in the last 5 years in a scientific or regulatory environment. And maybe we actually then have something in our rated that would be, but if you've used this methodology for your data collection, that makes you even that much more appealing. They are related, but again, they are different. You need to always make sure, of course, that you don't put something in the rated that they've already passed, of course, in the mandatory. The key thing with all criteria, though, is that it has to be tied back to the statement of work. So on our really complex requirements, literally somebody has to go back and map every criteria to what article and sub-article in that statement of work in order to get, whether it be PSPC, Treasury Board, Shared Services, or whoever is the contracting authority to proceed. Some tips for writing evaluation criteria. I quite like evaluation criteria because I always view that every file is a new puzzle, and I like puzzles. So the big thing with this is to think about what's unique about your requirement. Don't waste your time doing evaluation criteria that is so generic that the companies who qualified in that pro services or in that TBIPS or teaspoon or whatever contracting vehicle already would have met that. There's a thing called a flexible grid you need to complete when you're a bidder to show that your resource has so much years experience in performance measurement or in facilitation or whatever. And it's based on getting a a certain amount of points for your education, your certifications, and your experience. Everybody has to already fill that in. So don't actually do that first mandatory of, you need to have 5 years of experience as a facilitator, because you already have them filling in that grid. Make sure you also think about how many criteria you have. Imagine you have gone and you've got 10 mandatory and 10 rated criteria. Well, if you allow that the bidder will take about an hour to an hour and a half to prepare the data for each of those criteria, you now have a 30-hour bid that they've got to put together. Well, we're entering fourth quarter. Most consultants are 100% chargeable, so they're only putting bids together nights and weekends. So when your RFP comes to them, and someone else's that's got 3 mandatory and 3 rated, which do you think that they do that Sunday night? And you are competing with everybody else in the room for the same good talent. And that's something you need to think about, because I don't think you want the ones always that are 100% not chargeable right now. And so you also need to be thinking about it from another perspective. How long will it take your technical evaluation team to do the technical evaluation? So if you have 10 mandatory, 10 rated, it takes an hour per criteria, per bid, per technical evaluator, and you have up to 15 bids, I think you can say your technical evaluation is going to take more than a couple of days. Maybe we're talking a couple of weeks or months. So wouldn't it be better to be more specific? In terms of criteria, what are we looking for? We're looking for things that are measurable, objective, reasonable, specific to the task, clearly demonstrate the bidder met it, does not favor one bidder, particularly the incumbent, not too complicated and timely. That doesn't mean you have to fall into the age-old traps. You can be unique. So Steve and I often have this debate as what constitutes an expert? Well, sometimes an expert is that they've taught at a graduate level. Sometimes it's that they've spoken at an international conference. Sometimes it's they've written in the, let's say, the Canadian Evaluation Journal, or they've been the editor. You can have a variety of ways. I mean, for many of you to say, for every criteria you use the expression and how they just demonstrate it, and you include in your criteria how they will demonstrate that they met it. So you state it. You can have a couple of different options, because they all would warrant probably being a good expert. We can even use, we have used in the past, even the sort of journal ratings and saying it's got to be a journal article of from a certain sort of correspondence. The other thing is what's unique about your requirement. So sometimes you might have a broad base of different stakeholders, and so you need someone who has experience doing that kind of work. So don't just ask, have they done stakeholder engagements? Ask that they've got a certain number of experience using stakeholders that look like this and stakeholders that look like that. Because what you're doing is, yes, you're right. Procurement, will probably say to you, are you being too narrow? And it's really great to be able to say, no, I'm being specific. And that's a different thing, because narrow would mean that I'm probably saying, I want that company and that company and that company. But being specific means I have a unique situation. My world is, if you think of a public health agency, they've got all sorts of different stakeholders. And that kind of environment, many of the regulatory worlds, you really do need someone who has that kind of experience. Because the one thing we generally do say is you don't want a supplier who's going to learn on the job. So again, try to keep that in mind. How do you determine pricing? Because that's the final piece of that planning. And usually I'll say, well, look to the last time you contracted, potentially look at past invoices. Groups like PSPC have got tools called the task-based professional services task-based requirements. And they publish on an annual basis, by region, for every one of those resource categories, by level, the median rate. Check it out. I print it once a year because guess what? That's how I generally can say to someone, I think that's about an $8.50 a day. And so if we looked at our table of tasks, activities, deliverables, and timeline, I think you're looking at 30 days times that rate, you're probably around 35,000. Maybe we could sole source it. The next phase I'm not going to go into as much detail because guess what? If you look on the left-hand side, you're not the OPI, the contracting officer is. And really at this point, you're getting ready for that next phase. You're also answering questions that might occur during the solicitation. In terms of those, you want to be careful. You want to make sure as we go towards Christmas, as we go towards March break, as we go towards summer vacation, that there's someone there to answer the questions. Because the longer you drag it out, the more requirement there will be for a bid extension. Some tips to try and make it more efficient. This is when you should be knowing when the bid will close the day it's posted. And then I would allow 5 days after that, and I would set that as my date for my technical evaluation. I would pre-select my 3 people, checking their schedules to make sure they're going to be available for the week. And I probably would pick a spare in case somebody suddenly has something that will come up. I also would make sure that if I don't think the team is trained enough, that we get training for them. At a bare minimum, we go through every document so they can see what's happened. And finally, I would actually make sure that with the contracting officer, you have an agreed turnaround time should there be any issues that gets raised in the next phase, which is our technical evaluation. If you don't need it, you had a couple email correspondence. But believe me, I've had a couple of technical evaluations because I often get called in to sit in on technical evaluations and chair the team. And one of the things that I found in a couple of them, we had some issues. So what we had agreed is that when we would have an issue, we would state it in an email, we would state what our proposed situation was going, or solution was going to be, and then within 24 hours, they would say yay or nay. If they said yay, we could proceed. If they said nay, then we had to go have a conversation with legal. We've only used it a couple of times, but when we did, it was useful. Next phase is the evaluation phase. And this is one that is, you're again, not in control, but you definitely are in play a big role, shall we say, in the technical evaluations. The contracting officer receives the bids, they will go through all the bids, and that's why, again, I'll always ask, as they're about to post, how long will it take you once you receive them? And then sometimes you'll hear, oh, well, I'm away on vacation. Okay, could someone else then review them? Because you don't want to sit out for 2 weeks waiting, but they need to go through them all. Then you'll actually, from there, they'll send you the documents, and then you will have already pre-selected when and how you're going to do your mandatory consensus and how you'll be doing and when you'll be doing your rated consensus meetings, so those can now proceed. Some tips. One of the big things that people seem to think in a technical evaluation is that you're evaluating the quality. Well, quality is you had to have defined way back when you wrote the statement of work and the evaluation criteria. And so we often do that by adding definitions, options, all sorts of different things. Because in the technical evaluation room, you're validating. You're validating that the information is what you were looking for. And that's where sometimes we've had some surprises. In one of the ones I had, it was for a communications, someone to do a communications plan, and we asked the question for them to give us some answers as to a business, how they would deal with a 24/7 communications cycle. And they started to talk in their bid about a fax room. We kept thinking, that's not what we were talking about. So that was where we actually came up with our answer, sent it in, and the procurement officer came back and said, nope, you're right. We searched the document. They didn't even use the word writing. They didn't use the word briefs. They didn't use anything that would be a communication device. So it was a fax was all we got. So again, the other thing, you need to actually tell the team that they have to review everything. And they can only go with what's in the document, not what they know. So many years ago, I had, again, a technical evaluation where we needed that the company had a certain corporate experience. And it was dealing with border service types of tools. And we needed that they had to have experience with cross-border activity, and they had to have a certain duration. And they were silent. So we failed them, because nowhere in the document was there a year, anything. So we couldn't prove whether they had the 10 years of experience or not. There was no number. So of course they asked for a debriefing, and they came in very huffy when it came after they had lost and had failed the mandatory. And they were really quite challenging in their aggressiveness. And we said, well, we went through the entire document. There wasn't a single number. Nowhere did it said 2 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, whatever. All you had to do was provide a number. You would have passed. Because you gave sort of some of the content, you just didn't give the final aspect. Because that's the trouble. A lot of our criteria is layered. It's got many different elements to it. So things have to be experienced within 5 years of bid closing, as an example. So again, there's a time clock. Anything older doesn't count. Again, the time to change that, if someone really felt there was a problem, is they should have asked a question during the solicitation. Because sometimes people will come back and say, well, you know, most of that work really goes back 6 years. Would the Crown, change that criteria to from 5 years from bid closing to 6 years? Sure. So again, the big thing is they're validating. We're almost at the end. You're at the contract approval process. And again, this is not you as the controlling piece of it, but you're participating in debriefings. But now's your time to get them ready for the contractor to come in the door. So make sure that they have, whatever you got to do to get access to those networks, or you have to loan them the computer, or you need to load a device of some sort. Make sure it all works then. If you need to let those people who are going to be interviewed, let them know that somebody's going to be cold calling them. You can even say, this company has won the contract, they're going to be approved, but they will be calling you, but this is why they're calling you. Because again, as the consultant who calls the cold call, you got to then go through a whole lot of hoops to explain why you're calling them to set up that interview time. And more importantly, if you tell them that the interviews will be probably that third week of January, that's a whole lot better, because if they can't do it, if you know now, you could adjust that timeline in that statement of work, because that adjustment we will allow when you attach the statement of work to the contract. And finally, the end, you're at the contract administration, and now you're back in control. But this is where you want to be keeping an idea of how progress is going. You don't want to just come in and interact with them at the very end when they produce the final report. Because if there's a problem at that point, probably legal will say, you got to pay the invoice and go on. So you want to, that's why I break it up into what I call chewable chunks, so that if there's a problem, you can address it earlier on. There's many a project that goes off track a little bit, you can bring them back on, and you can actually involve procurement in that. That's predominantly one of their big roles. But at the end, it's too late. And so those are some just small tips. And my final one before I hand you over to Craig is know your magic numbers. So it used to be that we would say, if you're going to sole source, keep it under $25,000. Well, right now it's $40,000 for services. Now, if you come with a $39,900 proposal, contracting is probably going to say, does that include tax? Because it's the $40,000 includes tax. You're going to probably say, do you think you're going to amend this? If you're not going to amend it, it's a discrete piece of work. They're probably going to say, well, why do you know it's $39,900? And then go back to that table again and say, well, we have this table, we've done our measure of level of effort, and even if we're off by a day or two, it's never going to be more than $40,000. So these are important things for you to keep in mind, because you can justify that sole source under 40. And if it's something that's going to be greater than 40, there still are reasons to sole source. You will have to answer those 7 Treasury Board questions. And usually with those 7 Treasury Board questions, it's usually around either why are they the only vendor who can do this? Is this an emergency? Is this not in the public interest? And there have been situations, in COVID for sure, in other situations where there's ownership of intellectual property. So again, I have one this morning where our client, the license is a good contract. We need to buy professional services now. The only one who can provide professional services for that product is the same company. And yes, it will be probably about $50,000. So we can defend it in that manner. A couple of other ones, the trade agreement. You'll see the number 100,000. That's because if you use pro services as your tool to buy a competitive requirement, you can't go over $100,000 because of the trade agreement with Korea. Canada's signed about 45, 48 different trade agreements, and each one elongates or changes a few things. But again, once you're over the $100,000 mark, multiple trade agreements apply. So if you're under $100,000, you probably are using a simpler tool, a quicker timeline. I'm now going to turn you over to Craig.
Thanks, Carolyn. That was so rich. Oh my gosh! Like when I was doing, when I was a client of procurement, I wish I would have had that PowerPoint deck because I would have saved myself so much time and effort. Okay, well you've got it now, and there are copies available of this deck on the site, I believe. Okay, so a little case study, lean procurement, just applying the concepts of lean to a procurement function, public sector, government function. I'm going to show you one slide probably. All right, just one slide, and we'll jump right to it because you can get a whole bunch of information that might be hopefully as useful to you as a client of procurement from this slide. So the issue that this organization faced was that they were doing competitive RFPs for IT, for cloud software, for example. We took the example of cloud software, over $100,000. So you have to go through an RFP process, the very process that Carolyn just described to us. And that was taking between 3 and 5 months, and more complex ones were taking up to 7 months. Well, that really slowed the core business down of this agency, of this regulator. So they brought me in to work with them, and about 15, 16 days of their effort and my effort, they came up with the future state, which was the current state now. They went from that 3 to 5 months to go through from first contact with the client, all these steps that Carolyn's just described, to the contract being signed. They're now doing that in 3 weeks. But more importantly, they're doing that in 3 weeks without heroics on the part of the procurement side or on the client side. And I think it's really cool that they've designed out a lot of the heroics and the scary stuff out of it. So just look at this picture. This is called a spaghetti diagram. These are the back and forths in that typical type of process. So cloud software over $100,000. Where are the back and forths predominantly happening between which stakeholders? Between procurement and the client, right? Between procurement and you. Well, the bad news is that you don't own the procurement process, but a bunch of the things that Carolyn's mentioned, if you do those things, you're going to have fewer back and forths because you're going to avoid this thing we call failure demand. Failure demand is basically demand or extra work that's created because something failed to be done, so something's missing. Something failed to be done right, so it's incorrect. Or something failed to be done clearly. And each one of those things, when they happen, result in some of these back and forth. So if you just followed what Carolyn described to you, you would probably shorten your procurement elapsed time probably by 25 to 50, maybe up to 50%, just by getting those things right. So really, really focus on what Carolyn's described to you. So a lot of the failure demand comes from, unfortunately, it comes from the design of the tools, the forms, the templates, and so on. They're designed by experts for experts. Well, and someone who's a first-time user will utterly fail at them. Anyone ever fill in the TBS 330 security clearance? You try to fill in a security clearance for a resource or a new employee. They must have 100 FTEs across the government of Canada doing nothing but rework on that form. I've offered to help them fix it for free so that a first-time user will get it right the first time. They're like, oh, that's interesting. Okay. Anyway, whatever. So we'll leave it at that. So back and forth, follow the stuff Carolyn mentioned. But some of the things that, just a couple other tips to give you that we've learned from looking at the overall process. You can't control the forms and how user unfriendly they are, but you can collar your procurement a specialist and get them to show you how to fill them in or show you successful examples so you get it right the first time. One touch, one and done. Ideally, that would be great. The other thing that is they were able to do, and their clients actually loved it, you could go back and forth for months on the statement of work and the rating criteria. You could go literally, if you did it by email, back and forth for months. Or you could book a meeting with your procurement specialist and get it all done. If you've done your research ahead of time, get it done in a half day. Literally face-to-face, 2 to 3 hours, you can be out there and ready to post that thing in the marketplace. So it's really easy to stay in our offices and to kind of lob emails back and forth at each other, but that's the slowest, most expensive way to work. Think about what we learned during the pandemic. So when we send emails back and forth, what we're doing is creating resource efficiency, individual, local efficiency. When we get together face-to-face, we're creating what we call flow efficiency. So during the pandemic, we learned some great lessons. We had a lot of urgent things we had to figure out very, very quickly. Did we do all of our work by email back and forth, or did we actually call a meeting and get everyone together and get it done? So there's great opportunities to do things face-to-face. I'll just highlight a few places where it really makes a lot of sense to sit down with your procurement specialist and do the work face-to-face. So here's where it makes the most sense. A kickoff at the very start to say, here's what I'm trying to do, tell me what I need to know, and which method are we using, show me what I'm going to need to fill in. And this is your responsibility, because a lot of procurement people won't do this for you. Sit down and say, let's make a project plan. Let's treat this like a project. Here's all the dates, who needs to do what. We'll put the dates in the calendar so that, okay, we've now closed, we've done Q&A, we've now closed the bidding period. We need to do evaluation. Oh, we have to book the evaluation. That's going to take us 3 or 4 weeks till we can find holes in everyone's schedule. However, if you book it 3 weeks or 4 weeks in advance, if you book all those events and put them in a project plan, you're going to be much further ahead. And so get that date in the calendar, treat it like a project. Developing the documents, evaluating the bids, and reviewing the draft contract. Those are all great places to do it face-to-face. Everyone reviews it in advance. One and done, it goes out the door. It's so much faster. Those are some of the main points that I would really suggest that you think about as you go through. I'm just going to look at a couple other things here that you might find interesting or useful. Most of the challenges, if you simply did the work face-to-face, you would be at least, I would say you could save 50%. That's without procurement changing its own process. You're going through the same steps, you're just choosing to do them a little bit differently. So I'd really encourage you to think about that. And the other thing I'd suggest you do, can we advance? I don't want to go through every slide. People who are controlling the slides, just know it's way at the end. Can we go to slide 41, please? 41, slide 41. Maybe they can do it at the computer at the back and just. Okay. You are fast. Oh my gosh. You must play video games at home. Look at that. All right. Almost there. We're almost there. All right. Keep going. There it is. Stop that right there. One of the most important things in trying to change the way that we work is, and we see this in every kind of process improvement initiative that we're involved in. By the way, procurement process, those principles that apply to a procurement process, guess what? They also apply to a staffing process. So if you want to staff 70% faster, it's almost an identical process. It matches almost one for one all the major steps. How can you tell this is a fake picture? It's a fake picture. What about it is fake? The Hertz logo. See, there's no soap or water on it. Well, if we advance it, here's how we can tell it's fake. In the history of the world, nobody has ever washed a rented car. So if they don't own the new way of working, it's not going to stick very well or at all, right? So making sure that you try experiments with your procurement officer, treat it like an experiment, and make sure they co-own it. They're much more likely to play along with you. And just to really treat these ideas as experiments, try them out in the spirit of experimentation. If you heard of the Marshmallow Challenge, build the tallest structure out of 20 pieces of spaghetti, a yard of tape. yard of string and keep a marshmallow on top. Look at the top performers, architects and engineers. Second top performers, kindergarten kids, because they treat it like an experiment. They put the marshmallow at the top and try to make it taller. Who are the worst performers? Recent graduates of business school, because they try to get the perfect plan and then they run out of time to execute it. So really encourage you to think more like kindergarten students and try something out and just try it, and in the spirit of experimentation, get them to follow. As well, this is one other thing I'll mention, just that as you go through those experiments and as you work with your procurement group, ask at each milestone, ask, since our last meeting, what worked well, what didn't work well, and what should we do differently? If we do that, we're going to find better ways of doing things, especially if you're a higher volume procurement user. So 3 things you can do: meet with your procurement specialist up front in that kickoff meeting, find out what's needed and when it's needed. And then try that project management orientation, where you're treating it like a project and in a spreadsheet. Here's all the dates, who's doing what, and book all those dates in advance. And the last thing is try those quick little huddles with your procurement, with all your stakeholders, to get the work done face to face and out the door. That is it. If you want a copy of the case study, you can email me. My contact information's there. So that's I think that's it for us. Now to questions.
Absolutely. How about a round of applause first for this great presentation? Happy to have some questions.
Hi there. My name is Michael Cunningham. I'm a consultant with BDO. I just want to say I really appreciated your presentation. Being on the consultant side, a lot of what you said resonated with me. I've spent countless nights, weekends, early mornings writing proposals, and I gotta say, I kind of think about it in terms of job security and putting food on my table. You know, it's how I stay employed, is winning work. Throughout that process, one thing we sometimes ask potential clients during the Q&A of the procurement is if they'll let us know the max contract value of the procurement ahead of time. Sometimes people, or I guess procurement officers, are happy to provide that information. Other times they give us kind of a negative response, like, how could you ask such a thing? So I'm just curious on your perspective, is that something consultants should ask? And second of all, is that something that procurement officers or potential clients should provide? Thank you.
I'll take this one. I don't know if I'm still on. I'd say yes, you should be asking that question. More in my role from the CIPM president, because I do a lot of work trying to train procurement officers, one of the challenges I have is that they're not very good at that side of it. But the client should at least be able to furnish them with, is this a $100,000 job, or is this a $200,000 job? Because there's a difference, and you probably could do both. And the thing is that if they write a statement of work too vaguely, and the evaluation criteria is, the traditional stuff, then we would look to the pricing information, like how you present your pricing information. And that's the weakness. A lot of procurement officers are really weak on method and basis of payment in the RFP, in the draft contract. They should be giving you more information there. So yes, I would say ask for it. The second part of it is, I think that when you ask those questions during the bid solicitation, honestly, depending upon the tool that's used, you kind of know. So if it's a pro services, it's under 100K, right? If it's a competitive TSPS requirement that's done at a departmental level, you know that it's no greater than 3.75 million. So that's still pretty big. And I still remember one of the first jobs I ever did as a consultant, and I knew we were getting the job, it was a given. But there was a language, there were 3 different roles in it, and there was a line in it that said 30 days level of effort. And I was tasked with trying to figure out what role did how many days. And I wasn't coming out at 30. I was coming out at about 45, 50. So I thought, I'm stupid, but I'm going to call the client and say, I don't see 30. And there was like this big intake of breath, and I thought, oh, this was the stupidest thing. Why did I do this? And then she started to laugh. She said, no, it was 90 days. Didn't you get that? I said, no, it says 30 days. She knew there were 3 roles. She was trying to convey it was 90 days level of effort. And so if they don't want to tell you the price, they could tell you level of effort. Is the other way sometimes when I find that they're a little too snarky, then I say, okay. Or what was the level of effort the last time you did this? Because I think that there's a weakness there on the part both of the, I'll say, you guys don't give enough of this information, and procurement doesn't do a good enough job on it. But as I say, they could do both. They could do the $200,000 version. They could do, and that's why sizing is an important detail. Like, how many of you need a literature review in your work for the consultant to do? Well, literature review could be an afternoon. It could be a day, it could be weeks, it could be months, it could be a PhD thesis. I mean, the reality is we don't know which one you need and want. And if you just say, I need a literature review, that's not enough sizing for us to know how to bid it. And so I might underestimate and win the job, which is what you don't want, or I might overestimate and win the job, and you don't want that. So sizing is important. So good question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Judy Lipsis. I'm a team lead at Infrastructure Canada. I'm just going to add a perspective of a government employee to your question. I think a big part of it, and yes, I do realize I'm being recorded, is that a lot of people who are working and doing the statement of works don't necessarily know the level of effort themselves, to be honest. It's taken me a long time to learn, and I'm not always great at it, because doing that level of effort and all of that is something that you do very much in the consulting world, and it's not necessarily something that we're exposed in the government. So that may be one thing, and they don't want to admit they're not doing it well. And then the other thing is sometimes we get bids where people will come in just at what the minimum price is or what the top price is, and it doesn't work well either. So happy to talk about it offline, a lot of different reasons, but I will keep that in mind for next time I'm asked that question. So thank you so much. Very, very interesting. Definitely learned a lot from it. I just want a point of clarification. And I'm doing this specifically because we're being recorded, so I'm going to start with my contracting officer, depending on your answer. So I remember at one point we were talking about the different criteria and whether to be specific and all of that. So from my understanding, you are suggesting that we be specific as much as we can based on our knowledge as to what we want to allow the contractor to make a better bid. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, but by specific, I'm often talking about what is it you're buying? Mm-hmm. What's unique about that? And so if, let's say, we were just talking about literature reviews. Mm-hmm. So let's say you are envisioning something that would be a very thorough literature review of both national and international sources, and you're expecting it to be a 30-day level of effort. Then for you to ask of that, and that's something that isn't that common, but you know for your requirement you need it, then why not ask that they have experience doing literature reviews of that significance, or with both national and international, and see if they could provide you either with a sample or see if they can provide you more details on it to make sure that it does match your requirement. That's what I mean by specific, because I currently have contracts with about 5 different departments, and they all think that the way they do it is the way everybody in the government does it. I have 2 contracts with transport, actually, as an example, 2 different groups, and they don't do anything the same. So, even within the department. So, all to say, what's unique about your requirement? I'm not saying that you should be saying, you need to have someone who's 66 years old, wears red shoes, has a lovely necklace, my daughter helped me pick it out, and has earrings that were bought in Mexico. Too specific.
No, you're talking about what we're looking for, and it's actually, that's very helpful, thank you, because I've been told the opposite from my contracting officer. And we've had some discussions about it, because I'm like, I need to know that they can do this specifically, right? So
one of the things that I've often then come back to them with is, well, how many companies are qualified in this resource category? Oh, 200, okay. And I need to go out to, depending upon the dollar value, I may need to go out to all of them, or I need to go out to 15 of them at minimum. So of the 15, like, again, you want a company that's going to come in and understand how to do the work. So what I've often said is, but I'll balance that specific with, maybe I'll go with 5 companies of the 15 that I know and we've experienced before, and 10 new ones. So you're balancing it with the contracting officer. You're demonstrating to them that you're open. You're not as narrow as I know I've been accused of being. But at the end of the day, I often will ask a client, what did you like about that contractor? I'm not telling you I'm going to give you the same contractor again, but what did you like about them? And often it's those small, little, subtle things that made the work go well. And so that's, again, it's a bit of a balancing act. The other thing, and I hate to say this, but sometimes you need to elevate things as well. I mean, I've got one poor client right now that's on his 5th procurement officer. And it's a large undertaking, but the problem with the 5th one is we're now getting comments on our statement of requirement that we were told we had to put in by the 4th one, that we were told we had to put in by the 3rd one. And again, at this point in time, my poor client's going, I've got 7 months left, and I need to have a contract. So there's some of that.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation.
Thank you again. Round of applause. I'm going to ask Judy Lipsish to come up and give us some closing remarks and on where we go from here. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Walt. So as many of you could probably tell, even though it's late in the afternoon, I am not Art. I am here on behalf of our president. So I just wanted to kind of reflect a bit on this day. So we've learned a lot about performance measurement. We've seen the importance of it. I know it's reminded me why I do what I do. So hopefully it has inspired all of you to go back as well to your jobs and be able to do performance measurement. Hopefully you've enjoyed this event enough to join us as members. It would be great to have you. We're always looking to get new members. In terms of thank you, I want to again thank each and every one of you for attending with us this year. We do hope you enjoyed the 2 days, and as I said, we hope that you will consider joining our membership. We value your feedback, so it is very important as performance measurement people and as an evaluator that you fill out the evaluation form. We want your feedback. We want to know what worked well, what didn't work well, and how we can make it better for next year. Also, just this will be sent to you electronically, but also a reminder that all of the presentations from today will be online. If they're not already, they will be very shortly. So we've had some great presentations, so do check out our website. In terms of specific thank yous, I want to thank the symposium committee members. So Tom Wallman, who was the chair, Steve Montague, Eric Champagne, Walter Zabriskie. I'm not thanking myself, that's just ridiculous. The Willow Group for all of their secretariat support, and Mahar Shirafat Nasseri, I'm very sorry if I messed that up, for all of his volunteer time to manage the social media events, not only for the conference, but for our RBM sessions as well. So thank you to all those people. Sorry, bear with me. I'm going to try to make the thank yous short, but they're very important. So to our gold sponsor, the Ottawa University, and especially the Professional Development Institute, the Office of the Vice President of Research and Innovation, and the Center on Governance, thank you very much. In terms of networking break sponsors, Performance Management Network, and the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation. In terms of lunch sponsors, the Carleton University Public Policy and Program Evaluation, and Goss Gilroy. All of our wonderful speakers and presenters. This conference would not happen without you. Our AV support technician, Advantage, so thank you guys very much. And last but not least, the conference center staff who have helped us in providing hopefully what you consider to be great food, if not, again, feedback forms and snacks, and help the symposium run smoothly. So again, with that, I'm going to wish you all a good evening and just remind you to please watch our website. We are going to have some really cool upcoming learning events coming out with a new board. I think it will be world-class, if I say so myself. And of course, do keep an eye on the symposium. And the best way to know what's going on with PPX is, again, to sign up for our membership, which, again, is free. Have a great evening.